The warning came too late for the Zorvath Empire, and they had ruled over 1,000 star systems for thousands of years with their beautiful crystal towers reaching up into the skies of countless worlds. But then the Hive arrived, and within just 3 cycles the Zorvath were completely gone, and not just defeated or made into slaves, but actually gone as if they had never existed at all. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the ESS Defiance and watched the video feed from the probe. They had sent deep into what used to be Zorvath space, and every single planet showed the same terrible thing, which was vast structures made of living organic matter that pulsed with strange glowing light and covered every surface like some kind of cosmic infection that had spread across entire worlds. Lieutenant Amy Chen looked up from her navigation console and her voice was tight with fear as she asked how many civilizations had fallen to this thing. And Dr. Carl Winters, who was the ship's expert on alien biology, adjusted his glasses and told her that 7 civilizations were confirmed, destroyed, and the Zorvath were just the most recent ones. And before them came the Kelani Collective, and the Dravik Unity, and the Sentinel Worlds. And each one of these civilizations was more advanced than humanity. And each one was absorbed in just a matter of weeks. Commander Lisa Hayes crossed her arms and stated the obvious fact that now the Hive was heading straight toward human space. And Morrison nodded grimly and told them that the estimated time of arrival to their outer colonies was 4 months, and Earth itself would be reached maybe 8 months after that. And he explained that the Galactic Council was in full retreat, and they had written off this entire sector of space, but humanity was not running away yet, because they needed to understand what they were actually dealing with. The Hive had appeared from the galactic core 3 years ago, and nobody knew where it came from or why it existed, but everyone knew its purpose, which was to consume and assimilate and grow without end, and it was not a fleet of spaceships or an army of soldiers, but rather a living organism on an impossibly large scale that spread from world to world like a disease, and it broke down everything, both organic and inorganic, into basic components, and then turned those components into more of itself. Every species that encountered the Hive tried to fight back, but every single species failed because the Hive adapted to every weapon and every strategy and every defense that was used against it, and it learned from each civilization it consumed, and this made it grow smarter and faster and more efficient with each victory. It achieved. Amy reported that they were approaching the observation point, which was 3 light hours away from the nearest Hive structure, and Morrison ordered all stop and told her to deploy the stealth field because he wanted every sensor they had trained on the Hive, and he told Dr. Winters that this was his chance to find them a weakness that they could exploit. Dr. Winters moved to his science console, and his fingers moved quickly across the controls as he began running deep scans using spectral analysis and thermal imaging and electromagnetic signatures, because if this thing had any weakness at all, they were going to find it, no matter what. But as the hours passed and the data kept coming in, their hope began to fade away because the Hive was completely unlike anything humanity had ever encountered before, and it operated on principles that made no sense according to normal biology, and it could survive in the vacuum of space and withstand extreme temperatures and regenerate from damage faster than any weapon could hurt. Morrison stared at the screens and muttered that there had to be something, because nothing in the universe was truly invincible, and there had to be a way to fight this thing. Amy suddenly called out, with urgency in her voice, that they had multiple contacts and Hive spores were heading directly toward their position, and Lisa said that was impossible because they were running full stealth, and there was no way the spores could have detected them. Dr. Winters looked up from his console with a pale face and said that unless stealth did not matter at all, and he explained that he was reading chemical signatures in those spores, and they were not searching randomly but actually tracking the ship's engine emissions and waste heat, and even the tiny trace elements they were expelling into space. And the Hive did not see the way humans saw, but instead it tasted its environment like a predator following a scent trail. Morrison immediately ordered them to get out of there at maximum acceleration, and told Amy to plot a jump to the rendezvous point as fast as she could. The Defiance's engines roared to life and pushed the ship away from the approaching spores, but more kept appearing, by the dozens and then hundreds, and they were converging from all directions like white blood cells attacking an infection. In a body, Lisa reported that the spores were cutting off their escape vectors and told Morrison that they were not going to make it to minimum safe jump distance in time. Morrison's jaw tightened because this was it, and this was first contact with humanity's potential extinction, and they were about to become the Hive's next meal. But he had not survived 10 years in deep space by giving up when things got difficult. He ordered Lisa to open fire with all weapons and told Amy to forget about safe distance and jump as soon as she had a solution. Ready, Amy protested that an unstable jump could tear the ship apart, but Morrison told her that the spores would definitely tear them apart, so they had to take their chances with the jump. The Defiance opened fire, and its railguns spit out tungsten slugs at incredible speeds, while missiles left bright trails in the darkness of space, and the Hive spores died by the dozens as their organic hulls ruptured and their contents boiled away into the vacuum. But for every spore destroyed, 2 more appeared in its place, because they were learning and adapting their approach patterns and moving in zigzag patterns to avoid the weapon's fire. Amy announced that the jump solution was ready, but warned Morrison that the math was bad, and really bad. But Morrison said he would take bad over dead any day, and ordered her to execute the jump immediately. Reality twisted around them, and the Defiance folded space around itself and vanished while leaving the Hive swarm, grasping at nothing but empty void. And for one strange moment, the ship existed in a place between places where the normal rules of physics did not apply. Then they were back and emerging into normal space many light years away, with their hull groaning from stress and alarms blaring across every system on the ship. Morrison asked for a damage report, and Lisa called out that hull integrity was at 70%, and they had breaches on decks 4 and 7, and the jump drive was offline. But the important thing was that they were still alive. Morrison let out a breath he had not realized. He was holding and said that was good, because they had just learned something very important about the Hive. Dr. Winters looked up confused and asked what that was, and Morrison smiled grimly and said that the Hive bleeds. And if it bleeds, then humans can kill it, and that changed everything about this war. The emergency session of the Galactic Council met on Sanctuary Station, which was a massive structure hidden inside a nebula, far away from the Hive's advancing front, and representatives from 100 different species filled the chamber, but their numbers were just a fraction of what they had been before the Hive arrived and started consuming everything in its path. Captain Morrison stood before all of them, with his uniform still bearing scorch marks from the Defiance's narrow escape, and beside him Dr. Winters projected images of the Hive's structure and biological scans and tactical data onto holographic displays that filled the entire chamber with glowing information. Morrison declared that the Hive was not unstoppable and told them that humanity had hurt it, and maybe not very much, but enough to prove that it could be damaged, and that was more than anyone else had accomplished. A counselor from the Threen hegemony, who was a species that looked like a walking crystal formation, spoke in a voice that sounded like breaking glass and said that humanity was young and did not understand the situation because the Zorvath had weapons that could crack planets apart, and the Kalani could manipulate gravity itself, and the Hive consumed them all anyway. So human primitive kinetic weapons were basically meaningless against such a force. Morrison replied with respect but firmness that the Zorvath and Kalani were gone, but humanity was still here. And maybe it was time to try something primitive for a change instead of always relying on advanced technology. Another counselor, who was a serpentine creature from a methane world, hissed that this was arrogance, and the same arrogance that led the Dravik Unity to believe they could negotiate with the Hive, and they were gone too. Just like all the others, Dr. Winter stepped forward and asked if any of those civilizations had tried to understand the Hive first, before just throwing weapons at it, and he explained that their scans revealed something crucial, which was that the Hive was not just one organism, but rather a collective intelligence that required constant communication between its parts to function efficiently. And if you disrupted that communication, then individual sections became significantly less adaptive and much easier to fight. The Threen counselor's light flickered with what might have been interest, and asked Winters to explain this theory in more detail. Winters continued and said that every part of the Hive was connected through a network of bioelectrical signals and chemical markers, and it was extraordinarily redundant, but it had a weakness because the Hive grew by consuming civilizations that communicated through electromagnetic waves or quantum entanglement or telepathy, and it adapted its network to counter all of those methods of communication. The insectoid counselor from the Vrex assembly asked what made humans different from all those other species. Morrison smiled grimly and explained that humans still use something the Hive had never encountered in a spacefaring species, which was simple sound waves and vibrations in atmosphere, because they talked to each other using their voices, and the Hive's network did not account for sonic communication, because every advanced species it consumed had moved beyond such primitive methods millions of years ago. The Serpentine counselor sounded completely incredulous, as it asked if the plan was really to defeat the Hive by shouting at it. Winters said not quite, and explained that they were proposing to weaponize sonic disruption on a massive scale, because the Hive's bioelectrical network was sensitive to specific frequency ranges, and if they could generate enough acoustic interference in those ranges, then they could effectively jam the Hive's communications, at least locally, in a limited area. Morrison added that while the Hive was confused from the sonic weapons, they would hit it with everything they had, including conventional weapons and nuclear missiles and antimatter, if they could get access to it. Because the Hive's greatest strength was its adaptability, but adaptation required communication. And if you cut that off, then individual sections became vulnerable to attack. The chamber erupted in debate, with some counselors intrigued by the idea and others dismissing it as desperate nonsense that would never work. But Morrison noticed something important, which was that none of them had any better plan to offer. Finally, the head of the council, who was an ancient being known only as the Mediator, raised a crystalline appendage and called for silence, and said that the human proposal was unconventional, but unconventional. Approaches might be their only remaining option, so they would grant humanity permission to attempt this strategy. But Morrison needed to understand that if they failed, there would be no second chances, because the Hive would learn from the attack and adapt, and humanity would actually make it stronger than before. Morrison said simply that they would not fail because failure was not an option. They could accept back aboard the Defiance, which was now repaired and resupplied at Sanctuary Station. Morrison gathered his senior staff for a planning meeting, and joining them were representatives from several alien species who were willing to contribute ships and resources to the plan, even though it seemed crazy. Commander Hayes pulled up a star chart and said they had identified a target, which was a planet called Kepler 442b, that was a recently absorbed world on the Hive's frontier, and intelligence suggested it was being used as a staging ground for further expansion. And if they hit it hard enough, they might slow down the Hive's advance into human space. Lieutenant Daniel Park, who was the ship's tactical officer, added that it was also isolated enough that if things went wrong, the damage would be contained to that system. Dr. Winters overlaid biological data onto the map and explained that they had been manufacturing sonic emitters based on the frequencies they identified, and each ship in the fleet would carry a dozen emitters, and they would need to deploy them in a precise pattern around the planet to create a disruption field that covered the entire Hive structure. On the surface, Captain Nina Torres of the ESS Vigilant, who had volunteered her ship for the mission, asked how long they had until the Hive adapted to their sonic weapons. Winters admitted that it was unknown, and their models suggested anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours, and they would need to accomplish all their objectives within that narrow window of time. Morrison studied the faces around the table and saw humans mostly, but also a handful of alien officers who had refused to abandon this sector, and they all knew the odds were terrible because the Hive had destroyed civilizations far more powerful than theirs, but they also knew that running away meant a slow death as the Hive consumed everything, world by world, until nothing was left. Morrison said quietly that they were not trying to destroy the entire Hive, because that was impossible with the resources they currently had, but they could hurt it, and they could make it think twice before advancing further, and they could buy time for humanity and every other species still standing to prepare better defenses, and maybe they could figure out how to kill this thing for good. Lieutenant Amy Chen, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up and said there was something else they should consider, which was that every species the Hive consumed tried to fight it with their greatest strengths, like advanced technology and powerful weapons and sophisticated strategies, and all of them failed. But what if the Hive's real weakness was that it expected its prey to be logical and efficient? Commander Hayes asked what Amy was suggesting exactly. Amy smiled and said that humanity's greatest strength had always been unpredictability and stubbornness, and refusing to accept that something could not be done, and the Hive had never faced a species crazy enough to charge at certain death with nothing but determination and improvised weapons, and maybe that was exactly what they needed to be. Morrison laughed without much humor and said that Amy was basically saying their best weapon was being too stupid to know when they were beaten. Amy replied that she was saying their best weapon was refusing to be beaten, and the Hive had learned to counter intelligence, but it had never had to counter pure, stubborn human spite before. The room fell silent for a moment, and then Captain Torres started to laugh, and it was the kind of laughter that spread around the table, and it was the kind of laughter that came before a desperate battle, when fear transformed into determination. Morrison said then they would show the Hive what human spite looked like, and ordered all ships to prepare for departure, because they were launching in 6 hours. The fleet emerged from jump space at the edge of the Kepler 442b system, and there were 15 human ships, plus a handful of volunteer vessels from other species, and against the might of the Hive, they looked like tiny fish facing a massive whale that could swallow them whole. The planet below was barely recognizable anymore because what had once been a world of blue oceans and green continents was now a throbbing mass of organic matter, and hive structures that were kilometers tall grew from the surface like infected tissue, and they pulsed with bioluminescent light that made the whole planet glow. And spore ships the size of cities orbited the planet in precise patterns like a fleet of living vessels ready to spread the infection. Further into space, Lieutenant Park whispered from his console, asking how they were supposed to fight something that big, and that alien Morrison replied that they would fight it one piece at a time, and he opened a channel to the entire fleet, and ordered all ships to execute pattern delta and deploy sonic emitters on his mark. The fleet split into 3 groups, with each one approaching the planet from a different angle, and the Hive's spore ships immediately began to respond by braking from their orbits to intercept the intruders, because the Hive knew something was coming, even if it did not know what. Commander Hayes reported that the Hive had detected them, and there were 37 contacts inbound, and time to intercept was 4 minutes. Morrison told Amy to take them into atmospheric entry and get them below those spore ships, because they needed to deploy the emitters at ground level for maximum effect on the Hive's network. The Defiance dove toward the planet, and her hull started heating up as she hit the upper atmosphere, and behind her the rest of the fleet followed, with half staying in orbit to engage the spore ships, while the other half descended with Morrison toward the surface park, announced that the first emitter was away as they dropped below 10,000 meters, and the device fell from the Defiance's cargo bay with its thrusters firing to guide it toward a predetermined location, and then the second emitter was away, and then the third, all. Across the planet, ships were dropping their payloads, and the sonic emitters embedded themselves deep in the Hive's organic structures. By drilling through the biomass like bullets, Hayes confirmed that all emitters were deployed and synchronization was in progress, and told Dr. Winters that it was his show now. In the Defiance's science bay, Winters worked frantically at his console, because each emitter needed to activate at precisely the right moment and broadcast at precisely the right frequency, or the whole plan would fail, and the margins for error were incredibly small. Winters announced that synchronization was complete, and he was activating in 3 seconds, and then 2, and then 1, and then mark. The emitters came to life, and they made no sound that human ears could hear because their frequencies were too low, and their vibrations were too intense. But across the planet, the Hive's reaction was immediate and violent. The bioelectrical network that connected every part of the Hive structure began to spasm and shake, and individual sections lost contact with the greater whole, and the massive organic towers stopped their rhythmic pulsing, and spore ships in orbit suddenly lost coordination, and their attack patterns fell into complete chaos. Amy breathed out the words that it was working, and said that it was actually working just like they planned. Morrison warned them not to celebrate yet, and ordered all ships to open fire with all weapons, and told them to target the largest structures because they needed to do as much damage as possible before the Hive adapted to their sonic attack. The fleet opened fire, and railguns hammered the Hive's towers, and nuclear missiles bloomed like miniature suns and energy weapons, carved glowing trenches through the organic matter, and for the first time in recorded history, the Hive was taking damage faster than it could regenerate and repair itself. Morrison ordered them to target the spore ships in orbit, and said they could Not let any of them escape to spread information about human tactics to other Hive systems. Captain Torres's voice came over the comm and said that Vigilant was engaging orbital targets, and they had 3 confirmed kills, and these things were slow and stupid without their coordination with the main network. But even as the battle raged, Dr. Winters was monitoring the Hive's bioelectrical patterns, and what he saw made his blood run cold with fear. Winters called out to Morrison and said that the Hive was adapting already, and it was growing new neural pathways that were less sensitive to the sonic interference, and he was seeing redundancy systems coming online, and they had maybe 20 minutes before the emitters became completely ineffective. Morrison checked the tactical display and saw that they had destroyed perhaps 5% of the Hive structure on the planet, which was a significant blow but nowhere near enough to cripple it permanently. He said then they would go to Plan B and told Lisa to prepare the antimatter charges because they were taking this fight underground to the Hive's core systems. The Defiance pulled out of her attack run and angled toward a massive Hive structure that Dr. Winters had identified as a central node, which was a hub where the bioelectrical network was densest. And if they could destroy it, they might create a dead zone that would take the Hive weeks to repair. Park warned that the structure was heavily defended and they were reading massive concentration of defensive spores and they would be shredded before they got close enough to deploy the charge. Morrison said, then they would make the spores move, and told Amy to bring them in fast and low and use the Hive's own structures for cover, because the Hive would not fire on its own biomass. The Defiance screamed across the planet's surface at supersonic speeds and weaved between the massive organic towers and defensive spores launched in pursuit. But Morrison's gambit paid off because the Hive's weapons held their fire, rather than risk damaging their own structures. Amy announced they were approaching the target and 30 seconds to deployment. Hayes confirmed the charge was armed and her hand hovered over the release control, and she warned Morrison that once they dropped this thing, the blast radius was going to be tight, and they needed to be at least 5 kilometers away when it detonated, or they would be caught in the explosion. Morrison acknowledged and told her to release on his mark and counted 3 and 2 and 1 and mark. The antimatter charge dropped from the Defiance's bay and punched through the organic wall of the central node and buried itself deep in the structure, and the Defiance immediately went to full military power with her engines straining to carry her away from the blast zone as fast as possible. Hayes counted down and said, detonation in 10 seconds, and then 5 and 4 and 3 and 2 and 1. The antimatter charge exploded in a fury of pure energy as matter and antimatter annihilated each other and released enough force to vaporize everything within a kilometer, and the central node collapsed in on itself as its biological systems were unable to cope with the catastrophic damage. And then something unexpected happened that nobody had predicted. The Hive screamed. It was not sound in any conventional sense, but rather a psychic shockwave of pain and rage that every sentient being in the system felt simultaneously. And humans aboard the ships clutched their heads in agony, and alien crew members collapsed, and the Hive for the first time was hurt badly enough to react with something like emotion. Lisa gasped and asked what the hell that was as blood trickled from her nose. Dr. Winters was frantically checking his instruments and said that the central node was not just a hub, but something like a nerve ganglion, and they did not just damage the Hive's communication network, but actually caused it pain, and real actual pain that it could feel. Morrison wiped blood from his own nose and looked at the readings, and saw that the destruction of the central node had created a dead zone in the Hive's network exactly as planned. But more than that, the Hive's response was changing, and it was no longer calmly adapting to their attack, because now it was angry. Morrison ordered all ships to fall back to high orbit, and said they had accomplished their objective, and it was time to go before the Hive recovered. But as the fleet began to withdraw, they saw something that made their victory bittersweet, because the Hive was already responding, and new structures were growing to replace the destroyed node and rising from the planet's surface at impossible speeds, and the dead zone was shrinking, minute by minute. Winters said quietly that the Hive was learning, and it knew humans could hurt it now, and it was making sure they could never hurt it the same way again. The fleet jumped away and left Kepler 442b behind, and they had won a battle and perhaps humanity's first real victory against the Hive, but the war was very far from over, and everyone knew it. The attack on Kepler 442b sent shockwaves through both the Hive and the surviving civilizations, because for the first time someone had fought the Hive and survived, and for the first time, the seemingly invincible enemy had been hurt badly enough to feel pain. But victory came with a terrible cost. Morrison said quietly as he read the casualty reports in his ready room that 14 crew members were dead, including everyone aboard the ESS Ranger, because they got caught in a spore swarm during the retreat, and there was nothing anyone could do to save them. Commander Hayes sat across from him and her own face was drawn with exhaustion, and she said, "It could have been worse, because they hurt the Hive, and really hurt it, and that had to count for something." Morrison looked up at her and asked if it really counted for anything, because they destroyed maybe 5% of the Hive structure on just one planet. But the Hive had consumed hundreds of worlds, and even if they could replicate that attack 1,000 times, they would barely dent the Hive, and now it knew what to expect from humanity. A knock at the door interrupted them, and Dr. Winters entered carrying a data pad and looking like he had not slept in days, which Morrison reflected was probably true. Winters said without any greeting that he had been analyzing the data from the battle, and he thought he understood why the Hive reacted the way it did, and why it felt pain. Morrison gestured to a chair and said he was listening. Winters sat down heavily and activated a holographic projection from his pad that showed a complex network of neural pathways pulsing with bioelectrical signals. He explained that the Hive was not just a collective organism, but a gestalt, intelligence where every part contributed to the whole, but there was something else, which was an emergent consciousness that arose from the network itself, and when they destroyed that central node, they did not just damage infrastructure, but damaged the Hive's sense of self. Hayes asked if Winters was saying the Hive was actually sentient. Winters said it was more than sentient because it was sapient and self-aware, and humanity had just proved to it that it could die. Morrison leaned back in his chair and processed this information and said that every species the Hive consumed before had fought it, like a natural disaster or an unstoppable force. But humans fought it like an enemy, and a thinking enemy that could be hurt. Winters said exactly, and that changed everything, because the Hive had spent thousands of years consuming civilizations without ever truly being threatened, and it had never had to fear anything. But now it did, and fear made creatures do desperate things, as if to prove. His point alarm klaxon suddenly blared throughout the ship. Amy's voice came over the comm tight with urgency, and said that Morrison needed to see something on the bridge right away. Morrison ran to the bridge with Hayes and Winters right behind him, and when he arrived he found his crew staring at the main view screen in shocked silence. The display showed a star system 50 light-years from their current position, and it was dying. The Hive was destroying the system's sun by bombarding it with massive spore ships that burrowed into the stellar core, and the star was collapsing and going supernova, decades ahead of its natural cycle. Lieutenant Park said in a hollow voice that there were 3 inhabited worlds in that system, and 14 billion sentient beings, and the Galactic Council evacuated most of them, but there were still millions left who could not get out in time. Hayes said that the Hive was killing them, and all of them, and asked why it would do such a thing. Winters said quietly that it was because humanity made it afraid, and it was not just consuming anymore but destroying everything and eliminating any potential threat before it could grow strong enough to fight back. Morrison watched the star die, and watched billions of lives end in nuclear fire, and felt rage build in his chest because this was on him, and his attack had changed the Hive's behavior and made it more aggressive and more lethal than before. But then he said aloud that this was not their fault, because the Hive was always going to consume those worlds eventually, and humanity just changed the timeline, and maybe they gave the galaxy something it did not have before, which was a reason to fear the Hive and to fight back. He turned to his crew and told them to get Admiral Grant on Earth because it was time humanity stopped playing defense and started taking the fight to the enemy. The transmission took several minutes to reach Earth and return, and when Admiral Patricia Grant's face appeared on the screen, she looked tired but determined. Grant said that she had seen the reports from Kepler 442b, and it was good work, but they were hearing disturbing intelligence about increased Hive activity across the entire sector. Morrison replied that the Hive was escalating, but that meant humanity was hurting it, and he requested permission to take this fight directly to the Hive's core territory. because they needed to hit it again and harder before it could fully adapt to human. Tactics. Grant was silent for a moment and then said that Earth Fleet Command had been reviewing the data, and they were mobilizing every ship they could spare and every weapon they could build. But even with maximum production, they were looking at 6 months before they had a force large enough to launch a major offensive. Morrison said with respect that they did not have 6 months, because every day they waited, the Hive got stronger, and now that humanity had shown it could be hurt, the Hive was going to make sure they could not hurt it again. Grant asked what Morrison was proposing. Morrison glanced at Winters, who nodded slightly, and then said that the Hive had a weakness they had not fully exploited, which was that it was intelligent, but also predictable because it thought in terms of efficiency and optimal solutions, but humans did not think that way because they were chaotic and unpredictable and sometimes downright irrational. And he thought they could use that, Grant said, to continue because her interest was clearly piqued. Morrison explained that every civilization the Hive consumed fought it the same way with their best technology and their most powerful weapons and their most brilliant tactics, and they approached it like a problem to be solved. But what if humanity approached it like a war to be won? Because wars were not won by optimal solutions, but by determination and sacrifice, and being willing to do whatever it took. Grant said that Morrison was talking about guerrilla warfare and hit-and-run attacks and asymmetric tactics. Morrison said exactly, and explained that the Hive controlled hundreds of worlds, and it could not defend them all equally, so humanity would strike where it was weak and disrupt its operations and force it to divert resources, and they would not try to win battles but try to make the cost of fighting humanity higher than the benefit of consuming them. Grant considered this for a long moment, and then said it was risky, because Morrison would be operating deep in Hive territory with no support, and no resupply. Morrison acknowledged that was true, but if they could buy Earth those 6 months to mobilize, it would be worth any risk. There was a long pause, and then Grant nodded, and said that Morrison was authorized to proceed, but she told him not to make her regret this because Earth could not afford to lose its best ship and crew on a suicide mission. Morrison said they would not let her down, and ended the transmission as the screen went dark. Commander Hayes turned to Morrison and said that Grant was not wrong about it being a suicide mission, because they were talking about taking one ship into territory where entire fleets had been destroyed. Morrison said he knew that, but every great human achievement started with someone being crazy enough to try the impossible, and it was time to show the Hive what human crazy really looked like. Hayes smiled grimly and said that if they were going to be crazy, they might, as well, be the best at it. Morrison looked around the bridge at his crew and saw determination in every face, and he knew they understood what they were signing up for, and they were doing it anyway, because that was what humans did when faced with impossible odds and certain death. They refused to quit. 3 months later, the Defiance had become a ghost story in Hive territory. The massive organism that spanned dozens of star systems had never encountered anything like the human ship, because it appeared without warning and struck at important targets and then vanished before the Hive could respond, and it moved in ways that made no tactical sense and attacked targets that seemed random, but somehow always disrupted the Hive's operations. The Defiance had learned to live off the enemy by using Hive biomass itself for fuel and raw materials, and Dr. Winters had developed a process to break down the organic matter into usable resources, which turned the Hive's greatest strength against itself. But it was taking a terrible toll on the ship and crew. Lieutenant Park reported that they had used the last of their antimatter reserves as they jumped away from their latest target, which was a Hive processing facility that had been reduced to burning wreckage, and they were down to 40% on conventional munitions. Morrison said then they would have to get creative, though he knew Park was right to be concerned because they were running on fumes and held together by duct tape and determination. Amy called from navigation and said she was picking up a strange reading, and there was a massive energy signature 3 systems over, and it was not matching any known Hive configuration. Dr. Winters was already analyzing the data and said that was because it was not a Hive configuration, and those energy patterns were artificial and technological, which meant someone else was out here. Hope flared in Morrison's chest, and he asked if Winters could identify the source. Winters said he was working on it, and then paused, and said that he was getting something, and it was a distress beacon on Galactic Council frequency, and it was recent and less than 6 hours old. Morrison ordered them to set course immediately at maximum speed. The Defiance jumped to the system and emerged near a debris field that told a story of desperate battle and wrecked ships. Both Council and Hive drifted in the void, and at the center of the carnage was a single vessel barely intact and broadcasting its distress signal into the darkness. Hayes reported that she was reading life signs and 23 survivors, and the ship was the CSS Unity, which was a Council research vessel, and they were not going to last long because their life support was failing. Morrison ordered them to bring the Defiance alongside and prepare boarding parties because they were getting those people out. Morrison led the rescue team himself, and they found the survivors in the ship's core huddled together for warmth as their vessel slowly froze. Among them was a being Morrison recognized from the Council chambers, and it was the crystalline Threen Counselor who had dismissed humanity's plan as primitive. The Counselor chimed weakly and said that it did not expect to see Morrison here and assumed he was dead like all who ventured into Hive territory. Morrison replied that it took more than the Hive to kill humans, and asked what happened here. The Counselor explained that they were studying a derelict Hive structure and trying to understand its biology, and they thought it was abandoned, but they were wrong. And the Hive ambushed them, and most of their fleet was destroyed in minutes, and Unity managed to escape, but was crippled, and they had been waiting to die. Morrison said firmly that they were not dying today and asked if the Counselor could walk because they needed to move fast, once the survivors were safely aboard the Defiance. Morrison gathered them in the mess hall, and they were a mix of species and all researchers and scientists and all looking haunted by what they had witnessed. One of them, who was a Kalani whose species was thought extinct, said that Morrison should not be here because the Hive controlled this entire sector, and no ship could survive here, Commander. Hayes replied that yet here they were, and they had been operating in Hive territory for 3 months, with hit-and-run attacks and disrupting Hive operations and making them waste resources chasing the Defiance. The survivors looked at each other, in disbelief. The Threen Counselor said it was impossible because the Hive adapted to every threat, and it learned. Dr. Winters interjected that the Hive learned from logical threats, but humanity did not fight logically because they fought chaotically, and every attack was different and every tactic was improvised, and the Hive could not predict humans, because humans barely predicted themselves. Morrison pulled up a tactical display showing their operations over the past 3 months and said they had hit 53 targets and destroyed 12 processing facilities and 78 spore ships and disrupted communications across 4 systems, and they forced the Hive to divert resources to defend areas it thought were secure, and they did it all with just 1 ship. Another survivor, who was a Dravik whose species had been among the Hive's first victims, asked why Morrison would risk so much for a war he could not win. Morrison said simply that someone had to fight, and giving up meant extinction, and humanity did not accept extinction as an option. The Threen Counselor's light pulsed thoughtfully and said that when they first met, it called humanity arrogant, but it was wrong because what humans possessed was not arrogance, but faith, and faith that victory was possible, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Amy said with a slight smile that it was either faith or stubbornness, and sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. One of the rescued scientists, who was a methane breather named Dr. Kelvin Soar, spoke up and said that their research before the attack was not entirely fruitless because they discovered something about the Hive's structure, and asked if he could show them. Dr. Winters immediately brought up a workstation, and Soar began entering data, and a 3-dimensional model of the Hive's network appeared, and it was vastly more detailed than anything humanity had produced before. Soar explained that the Hive was not truly one organism, but a symbiosis of 3 distinct biological systems, where the first provided structure, and the second provided energy, and the third provided intelligence, and they evolved together but remained genetically distinct. And if you could disrupt the symbiosis and separate these systems, the Hive would collapse. Morrison asked how they could do that. Soar said they did not know because they were still researching when they were attacked, but perhaps with human tactical knowledge and alien scientific data combined, they could find a solution. Morrison looked at Dr. Winters and asked how long it would take. Winters replied that it would take weeks at minimum and maybe months, and they would need facilities they did not have aboard, Defiance Morrison said. Then they would find those facilities or make them. But before they could continue, alarm klaxons blared, and Lieutenant Park's voice came over the comm telling Morrison to get to the bridge because they had multiple Hive signatures and big ones, and they were converging on their position. Morrison ran to the bridge with the others following, and the tactical display showed a nightmare with 30 spore ships, each one massive, and each one moving with coordinated precision. Amy said they tracked the Defiance's jump signature, and there were too many, and they could not fight their way through this. Morrison said, then they would not fight, and asked Amy how much power they had in the jump drive. Amy said enough for one jump, and maybe two if they pushed it, and asked why Morrison wanted to know. Morrison said because they were going to do something the Hive would not expect, and they were going to jump directly into the center of the Hive formation park, protested that this was suicide, because they would be surrounded. Morrison said exactly, which meant the Hive would have to be careful about firing, or they would hit each other, and that gave the Defiance a few seconds of confusion, and that was all they needed. Hayes demanded to know what they would do with a few seconds. Morrison smiled grimly and said to make the Hive think humans were crazier than they actually were, and told them to load every missile they had left, and arm them all, but not set targeting parameters, and just set them to detonate on proximity understanding. Dawned on Hayes's face, and she said it was a fireworks show, and Morrison wanted to create chaos. Morrison asked Dr. Soar how sensitive the Hive's bioelectrical network was to electromagnetic interference. Soar replied that it was extremely sensitive and intense. Electromagnetic bursts could temporarily disrupt local communication. Morrison said perfect and told Amy to calculate the jump right into the middle of the Hive formation, and on his mark they would jump and launch all missiles and then jump again before the missiles detonated, and the explosions would create enough electromagnetic interference to scramble the Hive's coordination, and they would slip away in the confusion. The Threen counselor said this was insane. Morrison agreed and said insane was what humanity did best and ordered them to execute the plan. The Defiance jumped, and for one impossible moment they appeared in the center of the Hive formation, surrounded by enemy ships, and every alarm on the bridge screamed warnings, and missile tubes opened and emptied in seconds and filled space with dozens of warheads, and then they jumped again and left the missiles behind. The explosions were spectacular and created a cascade of nuclear detonations that lit up the void, and the electromagnetic pulse scrambled the Hive ship's coordination, and several collided with each other in confusion, and others began firing blindly and hitting their own forces. The Defiance emerged light, years away, and her crew gasped with adrenaline and relief. Morrison demanded a status report. Amy reported that they were alive and sounded surprised by that fact, and